She had always loved the sky. Ever since she was a little girl, she would sit by the edge of the airfield near her home and watch planes take off and land. She loved the sound of the engines, the way the wind seemed to dance around the wings, and the feeling that flying carried a kind of freedom no one on the ground could understand. While other children played games or read books, she drew airplanes on scraps of paper, dreaming of the day she could fly one herself. Her life was simple and her family had little money, but that never mattered to her. Dreams do not need money, they need courage. As she grew older, her fascination with flight only deepened. She studied everything she could about planes, aerodynamics, and navigation. She would borrow old magazines and manuals from the local library, memorizing details about engines and flight patterns. People around her often said she was just chasing a fantasy, that someone like her, quiet, unassuming, and without connections, would never make it into aviation operations. But she ignored their words. She believed in herself even when no one else did. When she finally applied to join aviation operations, she felt a mix of excitement and fear. The application process was intense. Tests were strict, interviews were tough, and every question seemed designed to see if she would break under pressure. The older, more experienced candidates seemed confident, and many of them came from families with a history in the military or aviation. She felt out of place at first, like a small fish in a vast ocean, but she didn't let that stop her. She studied harder, practiced more, and pushed herself in ways that surprised even her. When she finally got the acceptance letter, she was overjoyed. She had done it. She had beaten the odds and earned a place among some of the best pilots and operators in the country. But happiness was mixed with doubt. She knew this was just the beginning and the real challenge was ahead. She arrived at the training facility early, carrying her small bag and a heart full of determination. From the first day, she felt the weight of expectation, both her own and that of everyone watching her. The instructors were strict. They expected perfection, and they did not hide their disappointment when someone failed. From the beginning, she faced subtle challenges that made her question her place there. Her classmates sometimes looked at her as if she did not belong. She made mistakes, small ones at first, but they were noticed and remembered. Each mistake seemed to carry more weight for her than for anyone else. She could see the difference in how the instructors spoke to her compared to the others. They were harsher, more critical. Every time she failed a drill or miscalculated a simulation, she felt the sting of humiliation. Despite this, she worked harder. She arrived earlier than anyone else, stayed later than anyone else, and pushed herself to master every skill, every maneuver, and every procedure. She spent hours in simulators, going over every scenario until her hands ached and her mind felt heavy. Her classmates might have laughed behind her back or whispered doubts, but she kept her head down and focused on one thing: becoming a pilot capable of handling anything. Even with all her effort, there were moments when despair crept in. There were days when the instructor's criticism felt unbearable, when she questioned whether she belonged at all. She remembered sitting in the corner of the hangar once, exhausted and frustrated, thinking that maybe they were right, that maybe she was not meant for this. But then she would look at the sky through the open hangar doors and remember why she started. Flying was not about approval or recognition. It was about freedom, about being part of something bigger than herself. That thought pushed her forward, gave her the strength to rise and try again. Her determination did not go unnoticed by everyone. A few instructors saw something in her that others did not. They saw her persistence, her ability to stay calm under pressure, and her growing understanding of the aircraft she worked with. They offered small words of encouragement, brief nods of approval, or subtle advice on how to improve. These tiny gestures became her lifeline on days when everything else seemed impossible. But her challenges were far from over. One day, during a routine flight simulation, she made a mistake. It was not a huge mistake, just a small miscalculation that caused the aircraft in the simulation to veer slightly off course. But in the eyes of the instructors, it was significant. They gathered the class and discussed her performance, pointing out her error in front of everyone. She felt her cheeks burn with shame. Her heart pounded as she listened to their words, feeling as though all her effort had been wasted. A few days later, she received the news she had feared. She was being expelled from aviation operations. The reason given was simple, clinical, and crushing. She had failed to meet the strict standards required for pilots. For her, it was not just a rejection. It was a moment that made the world feel heavy. She walked out of the training facility carrying only her small bag and a heart full of disappointment. Every doubt, every whispered insult from before seemed to echo louder than ever. She felt the weight of failure pressing down, and for the first time she wondered if all her dreams of flying were over. But even in that moment of despair, she refused to give up completely. The fire inside her had not been extinguished. She walked to the airfield, sat on the grass near the planes, and watched them take off. The sky stretched wide and endless above her, and in that vast expanse she saw possibility. She remembered the countless hours she had spent studying, practicing, and dreaming. She thought of all the challenges she had already overcome, and realized that one failure could not erase years of dedication. She made a silent promise to herself that day. She would not let this be the end. She would find another way to fly. She would learn more, train harder, and prepare herself for the day when she would get another chance. Her expulsion was not the final chapter. It was only a pause, a test of her resolve. And deep inside, she knew that the sky still belonged to her, even if she had to fight for it. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. The world might have turned its back on her for now, but she would not turn her back on herself. She would rise again, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Flying was not just a dream. It was her destiny, and she would chase it no matter how long it took. That evening, she stayed by the airfield until the sun dipped below the horizon. The planes had landed, the airfield grew quiet, and the wind carried the faint scent of fuel and metal. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the hum of the airfield beneath her. It was a gentle reminder that even though she had been expelled, the world of aviation had not abandoned her entirely. Opportunities might be delayed, but they were not gone. And one day, she promised herself, she would return to that sky, not as a trainee or a hopeful, but as a pilot capable of facing any challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. She left the airfield that night with a sense of quiet determination. The path ahead would be hard, filled with obstacles and doubt, but she had learned something important. Failure was not the opposite of success. It was part of the journey. And as long as she held on to her dream, kept working, and never lost faith in herself, she knew that one day the sky would be hers again. After leaving aviation operations, she returned to her quiet life. But the fire inside her never dimmed. She worked at small jobs during the day, sometimes in offices, sometimes helping at the local airfield with maintenance tasks. But every spare moment was devoted to flying. She read books on aerodynamics, studied manuals on fighter jets, and spent hours watching training videos online. Some people thought she was wasting her time. They said she had already been rejected and should accept that her dream was over. But she didn't listen. For her, flying was not just a career, it was a calling. She found ways to stay connected to the world of aviation, even if it was from the sidelines. She volunteered at air shows, helping pilots with pre-flight checks, cleaning planes, and learning everything she could about the aircraft. Each interaction, each small task taught her something new. She took notes on flight patterns, engine behavior, and emergency maneuvers. Her attention to detail was meticulous, and slowly, she built a reputation among some pilots as someone who knew her stuff, even if she wasn't officially flying. Years passed, and during that time she did not stop dreaming. Every day she would wake up thinking about the sky, imagining herself in the cockpit of a fighter jet, feeling the rush of speed and the thrill of control. She practiced simulations on her computer, sometimes staying awake late into the night to perfect a maneuver or simulate an emergency scenario. Her dedication was quiet but unwavering. Even though life had pushed her down, she had never stopped climbing back up in her mind. Then one day, her life took an unexpected turn. A wildfire had broken out near a small town, spreading quickly and threatening homes, lives, and wildlife. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and the military was called in for help. It was the kind of crisis where every available pilot mattered. Commanders needed skilled hands in the sky, and for reasons she didn't fully understand, she was contacted. They had reviewed her previous training record and decided to give her another chance. It was brief and conditional, but it was enough to get her back in the cockpit. When she received the call, she felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. Her heart raced as she thought about the responsibility ahead. This was not a practice run or a simulation. Real lives were at stake, and the mistakes she had made in the past felt like they were hanging over her. She knew that everyone would be watching her closely, judging every move, every decision. But deep down, She also knew she had spent years preparing for this moment without anyone noticing. Now was the time to prove herself, not to the instructors or the critics, but to herself. She arrived at the airbase early, just as she used to during training. The F-16 she would fly stood on the runway, sleek and powerful, a machine built for precision and speed. She ran through her checks methodically, just as she had practiced 1,000 times in simulators and in her volunteer work. The pilots around her were tense, and some of them looked at her with skepticism. They remembered her expulsion and whispered doubts about whether she could handle a high-pressure mission. She ignored them. Their doubts were not hers to carry. Her mind was focused entirely on the task ahead, the fire, the people in danger, and the sky above. As she took off, the roar of the engine filled her ears and the vibrations traveled through her body. It was familiar and exhilarating, yet terrifying at the same time. The wind rushed past the canopy, and the view of the ground shrinking below her was both humbling and empowering. She thought of the families in the town, of the homes, schools, and streets at risk. Every decision she made mattered. There was no room for hesitation. She would have to rely on all the knowledge she had gathered over the years, all the hours spent studying, and all the lessons learned from failure. The Fireline came into view. Flames reached high into the sky, and thick smoke covered entire neighborhoods. The scene was chaotic, with emergency vehicles moving quickly below and people fleeing to safety. She adjusted her flight path, checking wind directions and fire behavior, trying to predict where the flames would spread next. It was a dangerous operation, more complex than any simulation she had ever run, but she felt a calm focus settle over her. This was what she had trained for, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. Her first pass was cautious. She observed the fire, noting where it burned hottest and where it threatened to jump to civilian areas. She radioed her observations to the ground teams, giving them updates and warning them of danger zones. At first, some of the other pilots questioned her approach. They had expected a more aggressive strategy, but she relied on her instincts and careful planning. The smoke was thick, but she maneuvered through it with skill, keeping the jet stable and avoiding debris that could have caused catastrophic damage. As she completed the first pass, she realized that her training, her years of quiet, unnoticed preparation, was paying off. She understood how to strike the fire line in a way that would create breaks, slowing the spread without putting herself or others at unnecessary risk. She communicated her plan to the team, and slowly, they began to trust her judgment. Her quiet confidence, built over years of study and self-practice, began to influence those around her. The next few hours were intense. She flew pass after pass, dropping controlled fire retardants and guiding the ground teams to safer zones. Each maneuver required precision and courage, as the flames and wind constantly shifted. At times she felt fear, a natural response to the danger surrounding her. But she channeled that fear into focus, using it to sharpen her attention and reaction time. Every movement of the jet, every decision about where to strike next was deliberate. She was not just fighting the fire, she was protecting lives. The other pilots began to notice her ability to read the fire and respond quickly. Whispered conversations turned into nods of respect. Even those who had doubted her before started to see that she was not the same person who had been expelled years ago. She had grown stronger, more skilled, and more resilient. Her experience, though unconventional, gave her a perspective that many trained pilots lacked. She trusted her instincts and combined them with careful observation, creating a strategy that began to contain the fire line. By the end of the day, the fire had slowed, and the immediate danger to the town had been reduced. The ground teams were able to evacuate people safely, and the homes in the direct path of the flames were spared. The commanders who had doubted her in the past now recognized her skill and determination. She had not only flown an F-16 under extreme conditions, but had done so with calm and precision, saving countless lives. When she finally landed, the adrenaline in her body slowly faded, leaving a mix of exhaustion and relief. The other pilots approached her, offering words of respect and congratulations. Some apologized for doubting her abilities, while others simply nodded, acknowledging the courage and skill she had shown. She did not dwell on past mistakes or the people who had rejected her. She focused on what she had accomplished and the knowledge that her perseverance had led her to this moment. That night, as she sat alone in her quarters, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Years of quiet study, endless practice, and relentless determination had finally paid off. She had been given a second chance and she had seized it fully. The fire had tested her, challenged her, and forced her to grow in ways that no training could replicate. And she had risen to meet it, proving to herself that she was capable of far more than anyone had imagined. She thought about the sky, still vast and endless, and felt a deep connection to it. Flying had always been her dream, her escape and her purpose. Now she knew that her abilities were real, not just in theory but in action. She had learned that setbacks did not define her, and that true courage came from facing fear head-on, trusting in preparation, and believing in oneself. Her mind was already turning to the future. She knew this mission was only the beginning. The world was full of challenges, and she would face them as she always had, with focus, determination, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing she had survived and succeeded against the odds. Flying was no longer just a dream. It was a proof of her strength, her resilience, and her unyielding spirit. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, she made another promise to herself. She would continue to rise, to push boundaries, and to show that no obstacle, no matter how great, could hold back someone who refused to give up on what they loved. The sky had tested her and she had passed. Now it was hers to claim. The sky looked different that morning. It was heavy with smoke, a thick gray haze stretching across the horizon, and the sun was barely visible through the burning haze. She felt a tension in the air that went beyond the smell of fire. This was not training, not a simulation. Lives were at stake, and the fire moved faster than anyone expected. She strapped herself into the F-16, ran through the pre-flight checks, and took a deep breath. Every sound, every vibration in the cockpit reminded her that she was alone in the air, responsible for more than just the plane. As she taxied to the runway, she could see other pilots preparing for their missions, all with tense expressions and focused eyes. She noticed some whispering among themselves, glances thrown in her direction, doubt clearly written on their faces. She felt the weight of their skepticism, but she refused to let it distract her. In moments like these, distraction could be deadly. She reminded herself of the countless hours of preparation, the years she had spent learning in silence, and the lessons she had learned from failure. This was the moment to put all of that to work. The engine roared to life, shaking her body with familiar power. As she lifted off, the wind rushed past, the world shrinking below her. She looked down at the town in the distance, the flames rising around it like fingers reaching for the sky. Emergency vehicles moved frantically along roads choked with smoke, trying to get families to safety. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was bigger than any challenge she had faced before, bigger than anything in training. The stakes were real and mistakes could cost lives. Flying over the Fireline for the first time, she scanned the terrain carefully. The smoke was dense and visibility was low, but she adjusted her instruments and relied on her instincts. Years of study had taught her to notice patterns, how fire moved with wind, how different terrains affected its spread, how hot spots could flare unpredictably. She marked areas that were most dangerous and communicated with ground teams to keep them updated. Her voice over the radio was calm and precise, a sharp contrast to the chaos below. Other pilots followed her lead, at first reluctantly. They had been trained to act differently, to take more aggressive approaches, but she knew that rushing into the flames without careful planning would make the situation worse. She kept her distance, studied the fire's movements, and adjusted her course. Each pass was like a dance with danger, balancing speed, altitude, and precision. She knew that one wrong move could end the mission or worse. The heat from the Fireline rose in waves even from hundreds of feet above. She could see trees and brush igniting in seconds, flames leaping unpredictably. She felt her heart pound in rhythm with the roar of the engine, but her mind stayed sharp. Every turn, every drop of retardant had to be calculated. She communicated constantly with the teams below, giving updates on the fire's direction and warning them of shifts in wind that could change everything. The town was alive with activity, firefighters moving with determination but also limited by the ferocity of the blaze. As she made her second pass, she realized that this mission was testing more than her skills. It was testing her nerves, her patience, and her ability to stay calm under extreme pressure. She had faced criticism and rejection before, but this was different. There was no room for doubt, no safety net. She was not just proving herself to instructors or peers. She was proving herself to herself, proving that all the effort and dedication of the past years mattered. The fire shifted suddenly, a wall of flames surging in a new direction, threatening a residential area. She reacted instinctively, banking the F-16 sharply, avoiding a plume of smoke and embers that could have thrown her off course. Her hands moved with precision, controlling the aircraft as if it were an extension of her body. She released the retardant exactly where it was needed, creating a break in the fire line that slowed the flames. She felt a surge of satisfaction, small, fleeting, but powerful. Each successful maneuver built confidence not only in herself, but in the pilots around her. Communication became critical. She guided ground teams through the changing fire patterns, warning them of hotspots and suggesting alternate routes for evacuation. She noticed a group of firefighters trapped by a sudden flare-up and calculated a path that would allow them to move to safety. It was risky, requiring precise timing and coordination, but she trusted her judgment. The firefighters followed her instructions and managed to escape the worst of the flames. Relief mixed with adrenaline surged through her, fueling her focus for the next pass. Time passed in a blur. She made pass after pass over the fire line, adjusting to wind shifts, flame movements, and smoke density. Her mind remained focused, each action deliberate and measured. She noticed that some of the other pilots began to mimic her tactics, following her lead instead of questioning her approach. Quietly, without needing to assert herself, she was earning their trust. The skepticism that had surrounded her for years began to fade, replaced by cautious respect. By mid-afternoon, the fire had reached a critical point. The flames threatened to cross a main road, cutting off escape routes for residents. She knew that if the fire spread any further, it could result in tragedy. She took a deep breath, adjusted her course, and made a high-speed pass, releasing a larger amount of retardant to create a protective barrier. The effect was immediate. The fire slowed and the flames retreated slightly. Ground teams moved in to reinforce the break, using her work as an opportunity to protect homes and evacuate people safely. Even with the temporary success, the fire remained unpredictable. It leaped over natural barriers, shifted with the wind, and ignited new areas. She had to stay alert, constantly reading the terrain and fire behavior, anticipating the next movement. Each decision carried weight. Each pass tested her skill and judgment. She felt the full responsibility of the mission, knowing that her choices could mean the difference between life and death. Despite the danger, she found a rhythm. The hours in the sky, the constant calculations, and the precise maneuvers became almost meditative. Her body was exhausted, her muscles ached, and her mind was tense, but there was also a deep sense of purpose. Every drop of retardant, every instruction to ground teams, every adjustment in flight was part of a larger goal: saving lives and protecting the town. She felt the satisfaction of competence, of knowing she could rise to the challenge when it mattered most. At one point, a sudden gust of wind pushed the smoke in an unexpected direction, reducing visibility dramatically. She adjusted her instruments, relied on her training, and navigated through the haze, keeping the F-16 steady. Panic would have been easy, but she had learned to stay calm under pressure. She trusted herself, her instincts, and the preparation she had done over years of study and practice. It was a test of skill, courage, and determination all at once. Other pilots began to follow her lead more consistently. The fire line was chaotic, but together, they formed a coordinated effort. She directed their movements, suggested targets for retardant drops, and communicated constantly to avoid collisions or mistakes. Her voice over the radio was steady, clear, and authoritative. It was the quiet strength that comes from confidence built on preparation, skill, and experience. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The fire was still dangerous, but the chaos was being managed. As the day went on, she noticed the impact of her work. Flames that had threatened homes were now contained. Streets that could have been blocked were open. Families were moving to safety, guided by her instructions and the work of ground teams. She felt a sense of relief, but also a renewed focus. The fire was not fully under control, and she knew the mission would continue for hours. Exhaustion pressed on her body, but her mind stayed sharp. She had learned to operate under pressure, and she was not about to let fatigue compromise her focus. Every pass over the fire line reinforced her sense of purpose. She realized that this was what flying meant to her. Not the thrill of speed, not the technical mastery, but the ability to make a difference. Each drop of retardant, each maneuver, each calculation mattered because people depended on her. She thought about the time she had been expelled, the doubts and criticisms, and she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had been rejected before, underestimated, and told she could not succeed. Yet here she was, flying in conditions that demanded every ounce of skill and courage she possessed. The other pilots were watching her closely now, no longer whispering doubts but observing with respect. Some began to seek her advice mid-mission, asking how she assessed certain fire patterns or why she chose specific targets for retardant drops. She offered guidance calmly and without ego, sharing her knowledge and coordinating the team effectively. Her leadership was quiet but undeniable, rooted in experience, preparation, and instinct rather than formal authority. By evening, the Fireline was partially contained and emergency teams had secured most of the town. She felt a mix of exhaustion, relief, and quiet pride. She had faced one of the most dangerous and unpredictable situations she could imagine, and she had succeeded not through luck, but through skill, preparation, and perseverance. Her body ached, her mind was drained, but she felt alive in a way she never had before. Landing the F-16, she was greeted with nods and congratulations from the other pilots. They recognized her courage, her skill. The next morning, the fire was still raging, but there was a sense of urgency in the air. The town was on edge, families waiting for updates, firefighters working tirelessly, and the military coordinating from above and below. She knew the day ahead would be harder than the last. The fire had gained strength overnight, shifting unpredictably with the wind, and some areas that had seemed safe were now under threat. She climbed into the cockpit of the F-16, feeling the familiar mix of fear and focus that came before a mission like this. She ran through her checks carefully, ensuring every system was functioning perfectly. Today there could be no mistakes. As she taxied to the runway, she glanced at the other pilots. They had watched her work yesterday and, for the first time, seemed to trust her instincts. Some nodded as she passed, a quiet acknowledgement of respect. It was strange for her to feel validation from people who had doubted her for so long, but she didn't let it distract her. Respect was a byproduct of action, not the goal. Her focus remained entirely on the fire, the people in danger, and the mission ahead. She lifted off into the smoke-filled sky, her eyes scanning the fire line, calculating every movement. Flames licked across hills, jumped over roads, and threatened houses that had been spared the previous day. The wind had shifted unpredictably, sending smoke in swirling patterns that made visibility even more difficult. She relied on her instincts, her training, and the countless hours she had spent preparing herself in the years since her expulsion. Each maneuver was deliberate, precise, and guided by the knowledge she had honed quietly over time. Her first pass revealed that the fire had split into multiple fronts. This made the operation more dangerous and complex. She communicated immediately with the ground teams, directing firefighters away from the hottest zones and guiding civilians to safety. She noticed that some firefighters were trapped near a cluster of homes, unable to move because the fire had cut off their escape. Without hesitation, she calculated a path to drop retardant in just the right places to create a temporary barrier. Her hands moved instinctively, releasing the payload with perfect timing. The flames slowed enough for the firefighters to move safely. Relief washed over her, but she knew this was only one moment in an ongoing battle. As she continued, the fire line became more unpredictable. Flammable materials, strong winds, and dry terrain caused the flames to leap with alarming speed. She had to make split-second decisions. She dove closer to the ground than she usually would, banking sharply to navigate around trees and ridges, releasing retardant at precise angles. The smoke stung her eyes, but she refused to pull back. Every drop of retardant, every maneuver, was a lifeline for the people below. She felt the pressure, but it sharpened her focus rather than breaking her. Other pilots began to follow her lead. Some had hesitated before, unsure of her tactics, but they could see the effectiveness of her strategy. She communicated clearly and calmly over the radio, coordinating movements, warning of hazards, and adjusting plans as the fire shifted. She had become the quiet center of the operation, the one everyone turned to for guidance. It was not a role she sought, but one she had earned through action and results. At one point, a sudden flare-up occurred near a school on the edge of the town. The flames rose high, threatening to consume the building and the surrounding area. She assessed the situation quickly. She calculated wind direction, the angle of her descent, and the precise timing needed for the retardant drop to create a safe perimeter. The maneuver was risky, Getting too close to the flames could endanger her, but she knew she had no choice. She adjusted her flight path and released the retardant with perfect timing. The fire slowed, creating a temporary barrier that allowed evacuation teams to get children and staff to safety. She watched from above as people moved out of danger, her heart pounding with relief and gratitude. The fire continued to challenge her. It moved in unpredictable bursts, sometimes spreading rapidly, other times slowing as natural barriers intervened. She had to adapt constantly. Every decision mattered. The altitude she flew at, the angle of the drops, the timing of each pass. She found herself relying not just on technical skill, but on intuition, on the ability to read patterns and anticipate the fire's next move. It was exhausting, physically and mentally, but she felt a deep sense of purpose. She was making a difference. Every action saved lives, protected homes, and gave hope to people who had nowhere else to turn. Hours passed in a blur. She made pass after pass over the fire line, adjusting strategies, directing teams, and releasing retardant. Fatigue pressed on her muscles. Her hands ached from controlling the jet, and her mind was stretched to its limits. Yet she did not waver. She had been rejected before, doubted, and told she could not succeed. Today, none of that mattered. She was here alive and capable, doing exactly what she had trained to do in ways that no one could have anticipated. Her past failures had prepared her for this moment, more than any instructor ever could. The other pilots and ground teams began to rely heavily on her judgment. They trusted her observations, followed her instructions, and coordinated their movements around her strategy. She had become the unspoken leader of the operation, not because of rank or authority, but because of competence and calm under pressure. The Fireline, chaotic and unpredictable, was slowly coming under control through a combination of skill, instinct, and coordination. In the heat of the afternoon, she encountered the most dangerous challenge yet. A section of the fire had jumped across a road and was racing toward a neighborhood where evacuation was still in progress. She had seconds to act. She calculated her approach, adjusted for wind, and released a precise stream of retardant to create a protective barrier. The flames slowed, giving the residents and firefighters time to reach safety. She could feel her pulse racing, adrenaline surging, but she remained focused, scanning for the next threat, the next vulnerable spot. The mission stretched on. Hours of flying in extreme conditions tested her endurance. The smoke, heat, and constant decision-making weighed heavily on her, but she had learned to pace herself. She relied on her training, her instincts, and the experience she had gained over years of study and quiet preparation. Every successful maneuver reinforced her confidence. Every life saved reminded her why she had never given up, why she had spent years preparing for a chance like this. As the day drew to a close, she could see the results of her work. The fire was still burning, but it had been contained in critical areas. Emergency teams had managed to evacuate families, protect homes, and stabilize the town's perimeter. She felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing she had used every ounce of skill and determination to make a tangible difference. The exhaustion she felt was deep, but it was accompanied by pride and relief. She had faced the Fireline, one of the most dangerous natural forces imaginable, and had prevailed. When she finally landed the F-16, the other pilots and ground personnel gathered around. There were nods, words of respect, and quiet acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. Some had doubted her the previous day, but now they understood that she was capable, skilled, and courageous. She did not bask in the recognition. Instead, she felt a quiet fulfillment, a deep awareness that she had done exactly what was needed when it mattered most. Sitting in her quarters that night, she reflected on the day. The mission had tested every skill, every instinct, and every ounce of courage she possessed. She had flown through smoke and fire, guided ground teams, and saved lives. She realized that all the years of study, practice, and perseverance had not been wasted. They had prepared her for moments exactly like this. Failure had taught her lessons that no classroom ever could, and doubt had strengthened her resolve. She thought about the people she had helped, families who could sleep safely that night, firefighters who returned home uninjured, and a town that had avoided disaster. Each life touched by her actions was a reminder that her determination, even in the face of rejection, had meaning. She understood that courage was not about fearlessness, but about taking action despite fear. She had embraced that courage fully today, and it had made all the difference. The quiet of the night settled around her, and she allowed herself to rest. She had been tested, challenged, and proven capable. She had risen above past failures and exceeded expectations. She had become more than someone who loved to fly. She had become a pilot who could face chaos, make critical decisions, and save lives. The Fireline had been the ultimate test, and she had passed with skill, bravery, and grace. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift to the sky, to the vastness above that had always called to her. The sky would always challenge her, demand more, and push her to her limits. But she now knew that she could rise to meet it, that her past did not define her, and that her future was full of possibilities. The day had proven what she had always suspected. With perseverance, focus, and heart, there was nothing she could not face. And as sleep finally claimed her, she felt a quiet certainty. The sky, once a distant dream, was now a place where she belonged. She had faced fire, fear, and doubt, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable than ever. This mission had changed her, not because she had succeeded, but because she had refused to let failure or